The paper sat on Phineas Carver's desk like a loaded gun pointed straight at everything he had quietly, stubbornly come to believe in over the last 8 months. It was an expulsion order, official, stamped with the territorial seal of New Mexico, 1883. Judge Harlan Pruitt's signature curled across the bottom like a brand, and the language was plain and merciless. One Winifred Walker, unmarried woman of uncertain residence, was to be removed from the town of Red Rock Flats within 72 hours of the marshal's filing, escorted to the county seat at Las Cruces, and placed under the care of the Territorial Women's Reformatory pending review of her character and conduct. Pending review of her character and conduct. Phineas read those words 3 times, and each time the slow burn behind his sternum grew hotter and harder until it was something he did not have a clean name for, something that lived between fury and grief, and something else entirely that he had not yet let himself acknowledge. He looked up from the desk. Through the single dusty window of the marshal's office, he could see the main street of Red Rock Flats going about its afternoon business. The blacksmith's hammer rang. A wagon loaded with feed sacks creaked past. And there, coming out of Dolores Ruiz's dressmaking shop, was Winifred Walker herself, a bolt of blue calico tucked under one arm, laughing at something Dolores had just said, the afternoon sun catching her dark hair like it had been waiting all day for the chance. He pressed the expulsion order face down against the desk with one flat hand. He did not reach for his pen. He did not file it. And right then, in that single act of quiet refusal, everything between them changed forever, though neither of them knew it yet. 8 months earlier, Phineas Carver had not been looking for anything at all. He had come to Red Rock Flats in the spring of 1883 with 2 things: a marshal's badge that Territory Governor Lionel Hawthorne had pressed on him after the tragedy in Silver Creek, and a silence so deep and so practiced that most people in town took him for cold. He was 31 years old, lean in the way that men become lean when they have worked hard and eaten simply for years, with dark eyes that watched everything and gave back very little. He spoke in full sentences when he spoke at all, which the townspeople found refreshing after their previous marshal, a loud and performative man named Cutter Briggs who had been shot in the back by a cattle thief. He had publicly humiliated one too many times. Red Rock Flats in 1883 was a town of about 300 souls clinging to the edge of the Jornado del Muerto, that brutal stretch of desert south of Socorro that the Spanish had named the Journey of the Dead Man, and that had earned its name every dry season since. The railroad had come through 18 months before, and with it had come money, merchants, a new school, a new church, and a class of conflict that Phineas recognized from Silver Creek, the conflict between the people who had scratched their living out of the hard ground before the railroad and the people who arrived after it with capital and ambition and no particular loyalty to the place. Into this came Winifred Walker on the 3rd of May, 1883, on the morning train from Albuquerque. She arrived with a single trunk, a leather satchel that she never set down if she could help it, and a letter of recommendation from Father Ignacio Medina of Albuquerque's Santo Domingo parish that described her as a woman of considerable learning and impeccable moral character, who had fallen on difficult circumstances through no fault of her own. The letter was warm and specific and clearly sincere, which was more than could be said for most letters of recommendation Phineas had seen in his years as a lawman. She presented herself at the office of Mayor Silas Dodd and asked about the schoolteacher position that had been advertised in the Albuquerque Gazette. Mayor Dodd was a small man with large ambitions and an even larger sense of his own authority, and he looked at Winifred Walker across his broad desk with the particular skepticism he reserved for women who appeared both intelligent and unattached. She was 26 years old. She had studied at the Loreto Academy in Santa Fe for 4 years before her father's death had made that path impossible. She spoke English, Spanish, and enough Apache to hold a basic conversation, which was more useful on the frontier than Mayor Dodd was prepared to admit. She had been teaching the children of a mining camp outside Albuquerque for the past 2 years. She could do arithmetic, read Latin, and had an opinion about everything, which she expressed with a directness that some people found alarming and others found like fresh water after a long, dry ride. Mayor Dodd hired her on a 3-month trial, which was standard, and put her up in the boarding house run by Mrs. Constance Bell, which was respectable, and forgot about her almost immediately, which was a mistake. Phineas met her on her second day in Redrock Flats. He was making his morning rounds, which he did every day without variation, because consistent visibility was more effective than dramatic intervention, and he had turned the corner by the general store when he nearly walked directly into her. She was reading a notice board that the Redrock Flats Mercantile had nailed to the exterior wall, her head tilted slightly to the left, her brow furrowed in a way that suggested the notice was either interesting or wrong. He stopped. She did not notice him for a moment. Then she turned, found him about 3 feet away, and said, without any particular alarm, "Good morning. You must be Marshal Carver. I read your name on the office door yesterday." "Miss Walker," he said, because Mayor Dodd had mentioned her arrival. "This notice says the school building still needs volunteers to repair the floor before it opens," she said. "The school was supposed to open 3 weeks ago. The floor rotted in the spring floods. The town council approved the repair funds in February, but the lumber order was delayed." She looked at him with dark eyes that were both sharp and warm, a combination he did not often encounter. "Is that what they told you, or is that what actually happened?" He considered that. "Both," he said after a moment. "Mostly." She nodded, as though she had expected exactly that answer, and then she thanked him politely and walked away, and Phineas stood on the boardwalk for a moment longer than was strictly necessary before continuing his rounds. Over the following weeks, Winifred made herself known to Redrock Flats in the way that people with genuine warmth and genuine competence always do, not by announcing themselves, but by showing up. She organized the volunteer work party to fix the schoolhouse floor herself, dragooning the blacksmith's 3 grown sons and 2 ranch hands, and the Baptist minister into service with a combination of flattery, practical reasoning, and sheer persistence. She opened the school on the 15th of May, which was only 3 weeks behind the original schedule, with 11 students ranging in age from 6 to 14, including 4 children of Mexican families who had been politely discouraged from attending under the previous arrangement, an injustice that Winifred addressed on her first day by simply enrolling all 11 children and sending a careful, firm note to the town council explaining that she taught every child whose family lived in Redrock Flats, and that if they found this policy objectionable, they were welcome to discuss it with her directly. None of them did, which was also, in its way, a form of cowardice. Phineas began to notice things. The way she walked with purpose, not performance. The way she spoke to the Mexican women at the market in their own language, and the way they lit up in response. The way the children began to look forward to school, which was not something that had happened in Redrock Flats before. The way she read in the evening on the porch of the boarding house, a lamp balanced on the railing, entirely unbothered by the gawking of passers-by. He began to take his evening rounds past the boarding house slightly more often than was strictly required by his duties. He told himself it was because that end of town had some foot traffic issues after the new saloon opened. He did not entirely believe himself. The trouble with Judge Harlan Prout did not come all at once. It came the way most trouble in frontier towns comes, sideways and in pieces, wearing the costume of order and civilization. Prout rode circuit through 4 territorial towns, of which Redrock Flats was one. He arrived every 6 weeks to hear cases, sign documents, and collect fees. He was 62 years old, appointed by the territorial governor under circumstances that the Albuquerque Journal had described as cloudy, and that Phineas privately described as corrupt. He was a tall man gone soft with age and comfort, with white hair and blue eyes, and the manner of a man who had decided long ago that his authority was simply a fact of nature, like gravity or drought, not something that required justification or restraint. He arrived in Redrock Flats for the first time on a Tuesday in June, and within an hour of his arrival, took a particular interest in Winifred Walker. He saw her, as everyone eventually did, at the center of something. In this case, she was on the steps of the general store explaining, to a small gathering of townsfolk, why the territorial school board's decision to cut the funding for translated primers was short-sighted and harmful to the children of the region. She was neither loud nor inflammatory. She was precise and knowledgeable and right, which, in Phineas's experience, was often more threatening to certain kinds of men than any amount of shouting. Pruitt watched her from across the street with the expression of a man who has just identified a problem that needs solving, and Phineas, who had been watching Pruitt from the shadow of the livery stable entrance, felt the particular cold tightening in his chest that he associated with the moment before a situation becomes unavoidable. That evening, Pruitt invited himself to supper at Mayor Dodd's table, which was the standard arrangement, and over the meal, as Phineas learned from Dodd's wife the following morning, Pruitt asked a series of very specific questions about Winifred Walker, her background, her origins, whether she had family in the territory, whether anyone had undertaken the proper legal formalities around her teaching appointment, specifically whether she had produced evidence of her own good standing with territorial authorities. Mrs. Dodd, who was more perceptive than her husband and considerably more decent, told Phineas this with a look of careful concern. He was fishing, Marshal. I could not say for what exactly, but he was fishing. Phineas thanked her, and that afternoon he went to find Winifred Walker. He found her in the schoolhouse after the children had gone, erasing the day's arithmetic from the blackboard, her back to him, chalk dust settling in the air around her like fine snow. "Miss Walker," he said from the doorway. She turned, and her expression shifted almost imperceptibly from the private look of someone absorbed in their work to the public look of someone receiving a visitor. "Marshal Carver, is something wrong?" "Judge Pruitt arrived today," he said. "He was asking questions about you." She was quiet for a moment. She turned back to the blackboard and finished erasing the last equation with slow, deliberate strokes. Then she set the eraser down and turned to face him fully, and her expression now was something he had not seen on her face before. Not fear exactly, but the careful stillness of someone who has been afraid before and has learned to hold it very still. "What kind of questions?" she asked. "Whether you had produced the proper territorial credentials, whether anyone had verified your background formally." She was quiet for another moment, and then she crossed to her desk and sat down and looked at her hands, which were folded on the desk top in the precise, deliberate way of someone who is stopping themselves from doing something else. "My teaching certificate was issued by the Loretto Academy and recognized by the Territorial School Board in Santa Fe," she said. "My previous employment at the Albuquerque Camp School was legal and documented. Father Medina's letter covers my character. I cannot think of anything that is properly in question." "Has Judge Pruitt ever encountered you before?" Phineas asked. "Before today?" Her mouth tightened very slightly. "Not in any formal capacity," she said, after a pause that was just long enough to mean something. He waited. She looked up at him. "My father was a lawyer in Santa Fe. Before he died, he was involved in a land dispute case in which Judge Pruitt rendered a decision that certain people considered convenient. My father did not consider it convenient. He wrote several letters to the Territorial Court of Appeals. He was not popular with Judge Pruitt. Your father is dead. He died 4 years ago. Influenza." She said this with the flat precision of someone who has finished grieving and arrived at something steadier on the other side. "He left debts. I left Santa Fe. There is nothing more to that story that ought to concern anyone." Phineas looked at her steadily. "Is there anything in your background that Pruitt could use against you if he were looking for something to find?" The question was direct, possibly more direct than was strictly polite, but she appeared to appreciate the directness. She considered it honestly. "There is one thing," she said. "When I first arrived in Albuquerque, before I secured the camp school position, there was a period of about 6 weeks when I was not formally employed. I stayed with a family who had known my father. During that time, I assisted briefly at a business that was owned by a woman named Clara Esteban." She paused. Clara's business was a boarding house that also served as a kind of informal refuge for women who had fled bad situations. Some of those women had histories that respectable society would find inconvenient. Pruitt has allies in Albuquerque who would know about Clara's establishment, and who might be willing to characterize my time there in an unflattering light if they were asked the right questions. Phineas was silent for a moment. "That is not an actual crime," he said. "No," she agreed. "But it is the kind of association that a judge with a territorial seal and a willing ear can use to declare someone a person of questionable character, in need of removal from a community. Especially if that someone is an unmarried woman with no powerful family connections and a tendency to make inconvenient arguments in public." She said it without self-pity and without drama, and that steadiness in her voice made something in Phineas tighten in a different way than before. This was not the cold tightening of professional concern. This was something warmer and more personal and considerably more unsettling. "I would encourage you to keep your paperwork in good order," he said, which was the most useful thing he could offer in that moment, and left. He thought about her on the walk back to the office. He thought about her more than he had permitted himself to think about her before. He thought about the way she had described her situation, clear-eyed and unflinching, and without a trace of the performative helplessness that a certain kind of woman in a certain kind of situation deployed as a survival tool. He thought about the fact that she had trusted him with that information when she did not have to. He thought about the expulsion order and the way it would look when it was filed, and the life she had built here in 8 weeks, and the children who came to school now who had not come before. He did not sleep well that night. The summer deepened into July and then August, and the heat in Red Rock Flats became the particular punishing dry heat of the Jornado country, the kind that bleaches color from everything and makes the air above the road shimmer and dance. The town went through its summer rhythms. The cattle drive that came through in late July, the 2-bar fights that resulted in cracked ribs and bruised dignity but nothing worse, the water dispute between the Haskell Ranch and the Community Ditch Committee that Phineas spent 3 afternoons mediating before it was resolved in a way that left both parties equally aggrieved, which he had found was usually the best result. Through it all, Winifred Walker taught school. She taught arithmetic and reading and history, and the geography of the territory, and a certain kind of rigorous, careful thinking that several of the older children's parents found either inspiring or alarming, depending on their temperament. She had a particular gift with the difficult children, the ones who had been told they were stupid or bad or in the way, and she had a gift with the parents too, the slow, patient work of convincing people that their children's potential was real and worth something. Phineas found reasons to walk past the school more often than his rounds required. Sometimes he stopped. Once she asked him a question about territorial history for a lesson she was planning, and they stood in the open doorway of the schoolhouse, while the afternoon light went gold, and talked for nearly 40 minutes about the history of the Jornado del Muerto, the Pueblo Revolt, the long chain of contested authority that had turned this piece of country from Spanish territory to Mexican territory to American territory in the space of a single human lifetime. She was both well-read and genuinely curious, which he found was a rare combination. Most well-read people he had met were interested in confirming what they already believed. She seemed genuinely interested in understanding what was true, even when it was complicated. "You know a great deal about this region," she said at some point in the conversation. "I've been here 7 years," he said. "Different towns, different offices, I pay attention." "You were in Silver Creek before this," she said. It was not quite a question. He went quiet for a moment. "Yes." She did not push. She seemed to understand, with the sensitivity of someone who had her own fenced-off ground, that there were questions that were not questions so much as invitations, and that an invitation refused was not a door closed, just one not yet opened. "Redrock Flats suits you, I think," she said instead. "You have that quality of someone who has decided to put down roots." He looked at her. The late afternoon light was doing the thing it did with her hair, and her expression was open and observant and entirely without guile. "Maybe," he said, which was more of an admission than he had intended. He thought about that conversation for days afterward. He thought about the word roots and what it meant in the context of his own life, which had been for so long a life of deliberate impermanence, deliberate solitude, deliberate silence. Silver Creek had taught him certain lessons about the cost of allowing yourself to be attached to people or places in the way that made their loss unbearable. He had been in Silver Creek for 2 years before the night that broke open and spilled everything he had built there into the dust, and afterward he had come to Redrock Flats with the firm intention of remaining useful and remaining distant, and not making the same mistake. He was not sure, that July evening, how close he was to making it anyway. Judge Prout returned in early August, and this time he came with intention. He arrived with a deputy named Whitmore, a thin, hard-faced man who wore his authority the way certain men wear new boots, with consciousness and discomfort. Prout spent the first evening at Mayor Dodd's table again, and this time he apparently came with documentation, because Dodd appeared at the marshal's office the next morning with the air of a man who has been told to deliver bad news and would very much prefer not to be the one doing it. The documentation, which Dodd laid on Phineas's desk with the careful movements of someone handling something hot, consisted of 3 affidavits from Albuquerque, 2 from men whose names Phineas did not recognize, and 1 from a woman who was identified as the proprietress of a boarding house on 2nd Street. The affidavits described Clara Esteban's establishment in terms that carefully avoided any specific accusation of illegality, while managing to imply, with practiced legal precision, that any woman associated with it was a woman of compromised character. They described Winifred Walker as a resident assistant who had, in the vague but damning language of the documents, participated in the operations of the establishment. "Prout says she needs to go," Dodd said. He was not meeting Phineas's eyes. "He says a woman of that character has no business teaching children in a territorial school. He says the law is clear on the matter of a judge's authority to order the removal of undesirable persons from a community, and that if the marshal fails to file the expulsion order, the judge can compel it through territorial channels." Phineas looked at the affidavits. He looked at the expulsion order, which was already prepared and waiting for his signature and his filing mark. "Are you ordering me to file it?" he asked Dodd very quietly. Dodd looked at the wall. "I'm telling you what Prout said." "That's not what I asked." A long, uncomfortable silence. Dodd was not a bad man. He was a small man, which is different. He was a man who had built a modest and comfortable life by avoiding powerful enemies, and he was standing in a room with a powerful enemy and an uncomfortable choice, and he was doing what small men do. "I trust your judgment, Marshal," he said, finally, which was the most courage he had. He left. Phineas sat alone in the office with the expulsion order and the affidavits, and the question of what he was, and what he believed, and what he was willing to risk. He thought about Winifred Walker on the steps of the general store, making her precise and righteous argument about translated primers. He thought about her in the schoolhouse with the chalk dust falling like snow. He thought about her voice when she described her father's debts and her departure from Santa Fe, flat and clear and absent of self-pity, and the way she had trusted him with that information, and what that meant. He thought about the expulsion order and the Territorial Women's Reformatory at Las Cruces, which was not a school or a hospital or any kind of refuge. It was a place where inconvenient women were deposited to become invisible. He turned the expulsion order face down on the desk. He did not reach for his pen. He got up and put on his hat and went to find Winifred Walker. She was at the market when he found her, examining bolts of fabric at Ruiz's stand with the focused attention she brought to everything, holding a piece of blue calico up to the light. He came to stand beside her and she looked at him, and whatever she saw in his face made her set the fabric down and step a little to the side, away from the other shoppers. "What happened?" she said. "Prout came back. He brought affidavits. He filed an expulsion order." He paused. "He filed it with my office for my signature." Her face did not change, but he saw something move through her eyes, fast and dark like a fish in deep water. "I see," she said. "I didn't sign it," he said. She looked at him for a long moment. "Phineas," she said, which was the first time she had used his given name, and the sound of it in her voice was startling in a way he had not anticipated. "That puts you in a very difficult position." "Yes," he said, "I know that. Prout will report you to the territorial governor. He could have your badge. He could try." He said it quietly and he meant it, and he saw from her expression that she believed him. "Why?" she asked, and it was the direct, honest question of someone who needed to understand, not perform gratitude. "Tell me why." He looked at her, and for a moment the words he had been containing for months, the words he had not permitted himself, pressed forward with considerable force. "Because you have not done anything wrong," he said. "Because what you have built here in 4 months is real and good and worth protecting. Because those affidavits are lies designed by a corrupt judge to serve a grudge against your father and to silence someone who makes inconvenient arguments. And because—" He stopped. She waited. "Because the idea of you in Las Cruces," he said, "in that place is something I find I cannot accept." The market went on around them, unhearing. Ruiz called a price to a customer. A horse shifted its weight at the hitching post. Somewhere a child shouted in play. Winifred Walker looked at Marshal Phineas Carver with an expression that was complex and unguarded and entirely new, something he had not seen on her face in all the months of their careful, circumspect acquaintance, something that looked like recognition. "You should know," she said, after a moment, "that I have been deeply careful in all my months here not to allow myself to feel things that would complicate my situation." "I know," he said. "So have I. I think we have been careful for long enough," she said. He held her gaze. "I think so too." The next morning, Phineas went to see Prout. He found the judge at the hotel, eating breakfast with the composure of a man who considers breakfast primarily a display of social confidence. Whitmore sat at a separate table, watching the room. Phineas took a chair across from Prout without being invited, which he knew would irritate the judge, and set the unsigned expulsion order on the table between them. "I'm not filing this," he said. Prout looked at him with the particular expression of someone who expected this and has prepared for it. "That is a violation of territorial law, Marshal. A judge's expulsion order is a legal instrument that the local marshal is required. A judge's expulsion order requires evidence of actual criminal conduct or demonstrable threat to public safety," Phineas said. 3 paid affidavits describing a woman as having once lived near an establishment of uncertain reputation do not constitute either. Miss Walker has committed no crime. She is a licensed teacher performing her duties competently and lawfully. The expulsion order you brought to my office is not a legal instrument. It is a personal vendetta, and I will not be the instrument of it." Prout's face had gone through several colors during this speech and had arrived at a dangerous red. "You will be removed from this post," he said. "I will write to Governor Hawthorne tonight." "Write if you like," Phineas said. "I intend to write to him myself. I also intend to write to the Albuquerque Journal, to the Santa Fe New Mexican, and to the Territorial Bar Association, with a full account of this incident, including the names of the men who provided those affidavits and their known associations with your Honor's previous rulings." He kept his voice completely level. "I have been a marshal in this territory for 7 years. I know how to document a case." Prout stared at him. "You would ruin yourself over a schoolteacher." "I would decline to participate in the persecution of an innocent woman," Phineas said, standing. "And yes, Judge, I would do that at considerable personal cost. I consider that a straightforward matter." He left before Prout could respond, because the speech had been calculated for maximum effect and minimum argument, and the only thing that could reduce its impact was a prolonged conversation. Outside on the boardwalk, in the early morning light, he stood and breathed the dry August air and felt the familiar cold clarity that came after a confrontation, the clear-eyed reckoning with what he had just done and what it was going to cost. Winifred found him there 10 minutes later. She had clearly been watching for him. "How did he take it?" she asked. "He will write to the governor," Phineas said. "I told him I would write first." She was quiet for a moment. "Phineas, what are you willing to risk for this?" He turned to look at her. She was standing very straight in the morning light, her eyes direct and serious, her hands still at her sides, and she was asking him the real question, the one underneath the one about the badge and the governor, the question about what this was and what he intended, and whether she was right about what she thought she had seen in him. "Everything," he said simply. She inhaled slowly. Then she said, "Then we had better be very organized about fighting this, because Judge Prout is not going to accept a single refusal. He will keep coming, and we need to be ready." He looked at her with something that was admiration and gratitude, and the beginning of something much larger and considerably more transformative than either of those things. "Yes," he said, "we do." What followed was 2 of the most intense and productive weeks of Phineas Carver's professional life. He and Winifred worked in the evenings, at the marshal's office, or at the library table in Mrs. Bell's boarding house parlor that Mrs. Bell diplomatically made available to them, assembling documentation with the care and precision of people who understand that a case built on truth still has to be built. They wrote to Father Ignacio Medina in Albuquerque, who responded with a letter that was both impassioned and legally precise, documenting Winifred's character and Clara Esteban's establishment in terms that were accurate and utterly refuted the implication of the affidavits. They obtained a written statement from the principal of the Loreto Academy attesting to Winifred's credentials. They located 2 former parents of children from the Albuquerque Camp School who were willing to provide statements about her teaching. And Phineas wrote his own letter to Governor Hawthorne, a formal, methodical, 7-page account of Judge Prout's conduct, cross-referenced with specific instances of rulings that had financially benefited parties with known connections to the judge, including the land case in which Winifred's father had opposed him. He drew on the records he had quietly been compiling since Prout's first visit in June, because Phineas Carver, whatever else he was a man who documented things. Those evenings in the boarding house parlor had a quality that neither of them spoke about directly, but that both of them were acutely aware of. The lamplight, the quiet of the house settling around them, their heads bent over papers together, the occasional proximity of their hands reaching for the same document, the way conversation moved easily between the work at hand and everything else, the things that mattered, the things they thought, the way the world looked from where each of them stood. One evening in the second week, long past when the work was done, they were still sitting at the table talking, and at some point Winifred looked up from her hands and said, "I never told you about my mother." He waited. "She died when I was 12, she said. "Typhoid. My father was devastated. He was a magnificent man, but he was not made for solitude, and after she died he became a little reckless with himself. That's how he got involved in the land case. He took it because it was righteous, not because it was safe, which was very like him." She paused. "I have always admired that quality in him and been terrified of it simultaneously." "The tendency to choose the right thing over the safe thing," Phineas said. "Yes," she looked at him steadily. "I notice it in other people." He held her gaze. "I notice it in you," he said. She smiled, slow and genuine and entirely private, the smile of someone who has stopped being careful in the particular way she had been careful before. "I notice it in you," she said quietly. "I have been noticing it since the second day I was in Raydrock Flats." The lamplight moved over her face, and the house was very quiet around them, And Phineas Carver, who had spent 7 years being deliberate and professional and distant, leaned forward slightly across the table and said, "Winifred." And she said, "Yes." And that single exchange, which contained everything that had been building between them for months, was both the simplest and the most consequential conversation either of them had ever had. Governor Hawthorne's response arrived 11 days after Phineas sent his letter, and it arrived with a speed that suggested the governor had been waiting for exactly this kind of documentation. The response was 2 documents: a formal notice of inquiry into Judge Pruitt's conduct, which would be investigated by a special examiner from Santa Fe, and a separate letter to Phineas that was personal and brief and said, among other things, that the governor had been receiving complaints about Pruitt's conduct for 3 years and had been lacking sufficient documented evidence to act. Phineas's letter, he said, combined with several others that had come in through different channels, appeared to constitute sufficient grounds for a formal inquiry. The marshal was thanked for his thoroughness. The expulsion order, the letter noted, was to be considered null and void pending the outcome of the inquiry. Phineas read both documents in the marshal's office on a Tuesday morning in late August, and then he put on his hat and walked across town to the schoolhouse, which was in session. He knocked on the door, which Winifred opened after a moment, her expression shifting from schoolteacher to something warmer and more specific when she saw who was there. "Can you step outside for a moment?" he said. She told the students to continue with their reading exercise and stepped out onto the schoolhouse step and pulled the door almost closed behind her. He gave her the letter. She read it twice. Then she looked up, and her eyes were bright with something that was not quite tears but was adjacent to them in the way that overwhelming relief sometimes is. "It's over," she said. "The expulsion order is void. The inquiry will take several months, but yes, Pruitt has no more authority over your situation here." She exhaled, long and slow, and closed her eyes for a moment, and he watched her face go through something private and deep, the release of a tension she had been carrying since before she arrived in Reed Rock Flats, the accumulated weight of years of being someone without powerful protection in a world that rewarded powerful protection, a woman who had survived on intelligence and competence and decency, and the occasional kindness of people like Father Medina, and who had never, until very recently, had anyone stand directly between her and the machinery of injustice, with the express intention of stopping it. When she opened her eyes, she looked at him with an expression that was as direct and as honest as everything about her, and she said, "Thank you, Phineas." "You are welcome," he said. She glanced back through the door's gap at her students who were audibly not reading their exercise. She looked back at him. "Will you come for supper tonight at Mrs. Bell's? She has offered the dining room." "Yes," he said without hesitation. Mrs. Bell's supper was roast chicken and corn bread and apple preserves that Mrs. Bell herself described as last year's batch but still perfectly good, and the dining room smelled of wood smoke and beeswax, and the faint, lingering sweetness of whatever pie she had baked that afternoon. Mrs. Bell presided over the table with the warm and cheerful authority of a woman who has decided that 2 people who very obviously care for each other deserve a proper meal and a clean tablecloth, and she managed to be simultaneously a perfect host and almost entirely invisible, which was a considerable social skill. Winifred had changed from her school dress into something in warm burgundy that did particular things to the lamplight, and her hair was down slightly from its usual arrangement, and she was happy. Phineas had not seen her happy before, not the way she was happy now, with the weight lifted and the evening full of possibility. He had seen her content, he had seen her purposeful, he had seen her amused and warm and fierce, but this was something else, something lighter and more open, and it worked on him with considerable effect. They talked through supper and long after it, while Mrs. Bell refilled the coffee and then eventually, diplomatically, retired to her sitting room and left the dining room to them. They talked about the future and the town and what they hoped for, which is the kind of conversation that people have when they are in the early stages of discovering that their futures might be related. At some point, Winifred said, "What happened in Silver Creek, if you want to tell me?" He was quiet for a moment. She waited, patient and undemanding. "I had a deputy there," he said. "A young man named Eli Marsh, 23 years old, smart and brave and not yet wise enough to know the difference between courage and recklessness." He looked at the coffee cup between his hands. "There was a group of men running a protection scheme on the smaller ranchers in the area. I had been building a case against them for 4 months. Eli found out where they were meeting and decided to go alone rather than wait for me. He was shot. He paused. He died." Winifred was very still. "I blamed myself for a considerable time," Phineas said. "I still do at certain hours. He was my responsibility. I should have read him better, moved faster. After it was over, I could not stay. Every corner of Silver Creek was him." "But you became a marshal again," she said. "Yes, because the work matters. Because if I had stopped, the only thing I would have saved was myself from difficulty, which seemed like a poor trade." He looked up at her. "And because I thought in a different town I could do it better, with more care." She reached across the table and put her hand over his. It was a simple gesture, unhurried and uncomplicated, and it hit him somewhere deep and entirely unguarded. "You have done it better," she said. "What you did here for me, the way you went about it, methodical and thorough and patient, not reckless. That was not the action of a man who did not learn from his grief. That was the action of a man who did." He turned his hand under hers, and she let him, and they sat like that in Mrs. Bell's lamplight dining room with the night outside and the town quiet around them, and Phineas Carver felt something he had closed off for 3 years move back into the light like a door opened after a long dark season. "I have been trying," he said, "to be careful about what I allow myself to want." "I know," she said softly. "I find I am no longer interested in being that careful," he said. She looked at him with those dark eyes, direct and warm and full of something that matched precisely what was in him, and she said, "Neither am I." September arrived with the first cool edge in the mornings, the dust settling, the light going more golden and less fierce. The cottonwoods along the dry creek began to turn, and the smell of the desert shifted from baked clay to something cooler and sharper. Redrock Flats went about its business, and Winifred Walker went on teaching, and Phineas Carver went on his rounds, and anyone watching them in those September weeks would have noticed that the marshal, who had always been quiet and solitary, now frequently took his afternoon coffee at the boarding-house porch, and that the schoolteacher, who had always been purposeful and self-contained, now frequently found reasons to walk past the marshal's office on her way to and from the school. They were courting, though they had not used the word. Both of them recognized what they were doing with the clear-sightedness of people who had been honest about everything else. They were just moving at the pace that felt true to them, which was not slow exactly, but careful, the care of people who know that what they are building matters and are unwilling to rush it into fragility. They walked together on Sunday afternoons, which in 1883 in a frontier town was a clearly legible social statement, and the town received this information with the warm, proprietorial satisfaction of a community that has been rooting for something and has seen it finally happen. Mrs. Bell was audibly pleased. Dolores Ruiz produced excellent commentary to her customers for weeks. Even Mayor Dodd, whose political weather vane had been whipping in different directions throughout the Pruitt affair, managed a genuine smile when he saw them together. On a Sunday afternoon in late September, they walked south from town along the old Spanish road that ran toward the Oscura Mountains, and the light was extraordinary. The way the autumn light in that country is extraordinary, amber and vast, laying itself across the desert floor with the kind of extravagance that makes the land look like it is being generous. They had been talking, as they often did, about something that had begun as one topic and had traveled considerable distance from where it started, and at some point they stopped walking without particularly deciding to, because the view from where they stood was worth stopping for. After a while, Winifred said, "I keep thinking about what it would mean to be here for a long time, not as a temporary thing, not as a 3-month trial or a provisional arrangement, but actually here, permanently." He looked at her profile against the desert and the mountains and the enormous autumn light. "And what does that look like when you think about it?" she considered. "The school growing. More children, better materials, a library eventually. I have written to the territorial school board about the possibility of an expanded building." And she paused, and there was a quality of waiting in that pause that he recognized. "A house," she said. "A real house, not a boarding house room." He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "There is a property on the east side of town. The old Patterson claim. 2 acres, a house that needs work, a well that was dug good and deep. The Patterson family went back east last spring, and no one has bought it." She turned to look at him. "You have been thinking about that property." "I have been thinking about it for some time," he said, which was the understated truth. She looked at him steadily. "Phineas Carver," she said, "if you are suggesting what I think you are suggesting, you might want to say it directly, because I find I am done being patient with indirection." He turned to face her fully. The mountains were behind her, and the amber light was all around them, and he had been a man who said things directly his entire life, and now was not the moment to stop. "I love you," he said. "I have been in love with you since approximately June. I would like to marry you, Winifred, if you will have me, and I would like to spend a very long time in this town with you, in that house with the good well, watching the school grow and being genuinely happy for the first time in a while." She looked at him for a moment that felt like it had weight and substance and the texture of something real, and then she closed the distance between them and put both her hands against his chest and tilted her face up and said, quietly but with absolute certainty, "Yes." He kissed her there on the old Spanish road with the Oscura mountains and the autumn desert all around them, and it was warm and deliberate and entirely right, and it tasted like something that was going to last. They married in November. Father Ignacio Medina came down from Albuquerque specifically to perform the ceremony, which he did with evident delight, and Dolores Ruiz made Winifred's dress from the blue calico that had been sitting in her shop since the day Phineas had not filed the expulsion order, which Dolores declared to be deeply appropriate, and which Winifred declared to be the most comfortable dress she had ever owned. Mrs. Bell supplied the wedding supper, which was prodigious, and the whole of Redrock Flats that was not confined to bed by illness turned out for it, because a community that has watched 2 people find each other takes a proprietary interest in the celebration. Mayor Dodd, to his credit, gave a toast that was both heartfelt and somewhat more eloquent than his usual public remarks, and at some point in the middle of the dancing he said to Phineas, with the private honesty of a man who has had enough celebratory whiskey to be sincere, "I should have backed you harder against Prout from the start, Marshal. I want you to know I know that." Phineas shook his hand. "You didn't get in my way," he said, which was what he genuinely felt, which was also, he thought, probably more than enough for now. The inquiry into Judge Prout's conduct concluded the following spring. The special examiner from Santa Fe had been thorough and unsparing, and the result was a formal censure, the voiding of several specific rulings including the land case that had damaged Winifred's father's reputation, and Prout's removal from the circuit. He retired to Albuquerque and did not, as far as Phineas ever heard, trouble anyone in Redrock Flats again. The justice, when it came, was quieter than the injustice had been, the way justice usually is. It came in documents and legal language and official stamps rather than in any dramatic reversal, but it was real, and the voiding of the ruling in her father's land case meant that a small parcel of land in Santa Fe that had been wrongfully transferred was returned to the Walker estate, which, her father having died intestate, meant it came to Winifred. She sold it and used the proceeds to buy the equipment for the school library she had been planning. She told Phineas about this in the kitchen of the Patterson house, which was no longer the Patterson house but the Carver house, and which they had spent the winter repairing and making their own, and she told him with the expression of someone who has watched a long-standing wrong finally corrected, not without grief for the fact that it had taken so long and that her father had not lived to see it, but with a deep and genuine satisfaction. He held her in the kitchen with the smell of coffee and wood smoke and the sound of the December wind outside, and she put her face against his shoulder and was very still for a moment. "He would have liked you tremendously," she said. "I think I would have liked him," Phineas said. "Any man who chose right over safe on principle is someone I'd want to know." She laughed, soft and warm against his shoulder. "He would have said the same about you. He would have said you two were exactly alike." "Maybe," Phineas said, smiling, "minus the letter writing." "Oh, you write excellent letters," she said. "The governor told you so." He laughed, which was something he did more often now than he had done in years, and she leaned back to look at him with the expression that was still, after months, one of the most arresting things he had ever seen. That combination of intelligence and warmth and the specific quality of someone who is exactly where they are supposed to be. Spring came again to Raydrock Flats, and with it the particular desert spring that is unlike any other season in any other place, the desert floor going briefly improbable with color, the air losing its edge, the evening stretching long and warm. The school had 9 more students than the previous year, the new ones including 2 children of a family of Apache descent who had recently settled near town, and Winifred's management of their enrollment was so smooth and so confident that there was barely a whisper of the friction that had attended the enrollment of the Mexican children the year before, partly because the community had grown, and partly because Winifred had spent a year building exactly the kind of trust that makes the right thing feel natural. The library was 6 months from completion. And in April of 1884, Winifred told Phineas, in the kitchen again, which had become the center of their domestic world in the way that good kitchens in good houses always do, that she was expecting a child. He was very still for a moment, and she watched him with the particular intentness of someone waiting to see what a person truly feels rather than what they perform. What he felt was an expansion in his chest so large and unexpected that it was almost frightening, a kind of joy so solid it felt like something he could stand on. "When?" he said. "November," she said. He took both her hands in both of his and held them, not speaking for a moment, and she watched his face go through every real thing, the joy and the awe and the edge of fear that honest people feel when they understand that life is about to ask something much larger of them than they have been asked before. "Are you all right?" he asked. "I'm very well," she said. "I feel strong." She squeezed his hands. "We are going to need a second room." He laughed, sudden and real. "The East Edition. I have been thinking about it." "Of course you have," she said. "You think about everything." "I think about things I care about," he said. "Then I suppose I should not be surprised that you have been thinking about an East Edition," she said, with a particular warmth in her voice that was entirely his, the register she had never used before him and did not use with anyone else, and which still, every time, moved him. The summer of 1884 was a busy one. Phineas built the East Edition with help from the blacksmith's sons, who had not forgotten how to swing a hammer, and who seemed to view helping the Marshal as a standing community obligation. The addition was 2 rooms, one for the child and one that Winifred designated as a study, because she had by this time accumulated enough books and papers and correspondence with the Territorial School Board and the Albuquerque Library Association that the corner of the kitchen table was no longer an adequate working space. The school expanded. The library opened in August, a single long room added to the east side of the schoolhouse, with shelves that Dolores Ruiz's husband had built and books that had come in boxes from Albuquerque and Santa Fe, and in one improbably generous shipment, from a library society in Cincinnati that Winifred had written to on the basis of a newspaper article she had read about their mission to supply frontier schools. The library opening was a community event. Winifred, who was 7 months along and entirely unencumbered by this fact in any way that affected her energy or her commitment to the occasion, stood at the front of the room and spoke to the gathered town with the authority and warmth of someone who has earned the place she stands in. And Phineas stood in the back of the room and watched her and thought about how completely wrong he had been, years ago, to imagine that keeping himself apart from places and people was a form of wisdom. It was not wisdom. It was a kind of poverty. And he had come out of it into something so much richer than he had allowed himself to hope for, that the contrast was still, at certain moments, almost overwhelming. She caught his eye across the room during her remarks, and something passed between them that was private and complete. And then she went on with her speech, and he went on watching her, and the late summer light came through the new windows of the library, and lay itself across the shelves of books and the faces of the children who would read them. The baby came in November, as predicted, in the middle of a cold, clear night, with a fire going in the bedroom hearth and Mrs. Bell on one side of the bed and the town doctor, a competent and unhurried man named Aldrich, on the other. Phineas was in the kitchen for most of it, which was where the doctor had put him, and he spent several hours engaged in the traditional activity of men in this situation, which is to say he made coffee, he did not drink, and sat down and stood up and listened to every sound from the bedroom with his whole nervous system fully engaged. The sound he had been waiting for came just before midnight, the thin, emphatic announcement of a new person arriving in the world. Dr. Aldrich came to the kitchen door. "A boy," he said, "healthy, good lungs, as you may have observed." Phineas was at the bedroom door in 3 steps. Winifred was propped against the pillows with the exhausted radiance of someone who has done something enormous and knows it. In her arms was a small red-faced person with dark hair and a very strong opinion about the recent change in his circumstances. She looked up at Phineas when he came in, and her expression was something that he thought he would carry with him for the rest of his life, would return to in the way you return to a place that is home, the absolute specific beauty of her face in that moment. "Come here," she said. He sat on the edge of the bed and she put the baby into his arms, and Phineas Carver, who had been a quiet man and a solitary man and a man who had learned to live without the things he most wanted, held his son and felt the world reconfigure itself around this new fact. "Thomas," Winifred said. "I thought Thomas, for my father." "Thomas," he said, and the name felt right, felt like something that would fit this small, fierce person well. "Thomas Carver." The baby opened his eyes and seemed to look at Phineas with the profound, unfocused scrutiny of the very newly arrived, and Phineas looked back with the absolute undivided attention of a man who has understood, in the last 60 seconds, exactly what his life is for. "Hello, Thomas," he said, quietly. Winifred put her head on his shoulder carefully, around the baby, and he held them both, and outside the night was cold and clear and full of stars, and the town of Redrock Flats was quiet around them. Thomas Walker Carver grew up in Redrock Flats and grew up well. He was, as babies tend to be when they have 2 parents of considerable intelligence and strong character, an emphatic and opinionated person from very early on, with his mother's directness and his father's steadiness, and his own particular quality that was entirely his, a kind of fearless curiosity that expressed itself in the dismantling of mechanical objects, the interrogation of strangers, and the climbing of structures that had not been designed for climbing. He kept his parents in a state of engaged attention that both of them found both exhausting and, in the honest way they discussed things with each other, genuinely wonderful. When Thomas was 3, Winifred told Phineas in the kitchen again that they were expecting again, and this time it was a girl, born the following spring into a May morning full of light and cottonwood seeds drifting on the air, a girl whom they named Clara, for Clara Esteban in Albuquerque, who had given Winifred shelter in a difficult time and deserved to be remembered in the name of someone strong. Clara Carver was strong. She was also quiet in the way her father was quiet, observant and careful, and given to watching things before deciding about them, and she had her mother's dark eyes and her father's patience. And from a very young age she had an uncanny ability to be still in a situation and see exactly what was actually happening, which was, Phineas thought, one of the most valuable gifts a person could have. The years went on. The school grew. The library grew. The town grew. Redrock Flats in the late 1880s was a different town from the one Winifred had stepped off the train into in 1883. Larger, more settled, more complicated, as all living things become more complicated as they grow. New businesses. A second church. A doctor's surgery that was a proper building now rather than a converted storeroom. An expanding network of roads, the railroad still doing its transformative work on the surrounding country. Phineas watched the town grow and adapted his work accordingly, because the work of maintaining order in a growing town is not static, and because he was a man who thought carefully about what he was doing and why. He trained 2 deputies in those years, men he chose for their steadiness and their judgment rather than their speed with a weapon, and he supervised them with the particular care of someone who had learned from Eli Marsh what it meant to be responsible for a young person in a dangerous job. Both deputies were still alive and competent several years later, which he considered the proper measure of success. The governor's office sent him a commendation in 1887 for his work on a counterfeiting case that had spread across 3 territorial towns, work that had involved 4 months of correspondence, 2 trips to Santa Fe, and a final quiet arrest that produced no drama and no gunplay, and sent 3 men to prison in an orderly and legally unassailable fashion. The commendation was framed and hung in the marshal's office where visitors could see it, and Winifred told him it was the least dramatic heroism she had ever encountered, and she meant it as the highest possible compliment. In the summer of 1887, a letter arrived from a woman in Santa Fe named Rosa Medina, no relation to Father Ignacio, who had read about Winifred's work in Redrock Flats through the Territorial School Board's annual report, and who was establishing a new school in the northern part of the territory. The letter asked if Miss Walker, whom the report had listed by her teaching name rather than her married name, might be willing to correspond about curriculum and methods. Winifred answered the letter, and then answered the next one, and over the following year the correspondence grew into something larger, a network of women teachers across the territory who wrote to each other about curriculum and methods and the specific challenges of teaching in frontier conditions, sharing lessons and ideas and resources. By 1889, the network had 14 members and had been formalized, with Winifred's slightly bemused consent, into something called the New Mexico Frontier Teachers Correspondence Society, which held its first gathering in Albuquerque in the summer of that year. Phineas took the children to Albuquerque for the gathering. Thomas was 5 and Clara was 2, and the train ride was, for all of them, an adventure of varying emotional registers. He sat with Clara on his lap, while Thomas pressed his face against the window with the expression of someone determined to see everything, and he looked out at the territory moving past, the desert and the mountains and the long dry country he had been a lawman in for over a decade, and he thought about what a different life this was from the one he had been living when he arrived in Redrock Flats with his badge and his silence and his determination to remain uninvested. The gathering was in a meeting hall in Albuquerque, a room full of women who were, collectively, doing one of the more important things being done in the territory, which was building the minds of the next generation of its people with care and rigor, and a genuine conviction that every child's education mattered. He watched Winifred move through that room with the ease of someone in their natural element, talking and laughing and arguing in the precise, energetic way she argued, and he was struck again, as he was regularly struck, by the force of her. On the evening of the gathering, when the children were asleep in the hotel room and the town was still around them, they sat on the hotel balcony and looked out over Albuquerque and drank coffee and let the evening be what it was. "This is something real," Winifred said about the society. "Something that could last. I did not entirely expect that." "You built it carefully," he said. "Of course it lasted." She looked at him sideways. "You say that as though it is obvious." "It is obvious," he said. "I have watched you build things carefully for 6 years. They always last." She was quiet for a moment. "I think about my father sometimes when I am in the middle of something like today. He would have loved this. He would have been insufferably proud and would have told everyone he met about it at considerable length." "That sounds accurate," Phineas said, "from everything you've described." "He would have loved you too," she said. "I've said that before. I keep coming back to it." "I keep being glad to hear it," he said. She put her head against his shoulder on the hotel balcony, and he put his arm around her, and the evening stretched out before them full of possibility and completeness in equal measure, the particular quality of a life that has been honestly built and honestly lived. Back in Redrock Flats, the years continued their work. Thomas started school, naturally at his mother's school, which created a complicated dynamic that both he and Winifred navigated with some effort and a good deal of private laughter. He was, as Winifred had told Phineas privately, the kind of student she would have adored if he were not her son, brilliant and disruptive and genuinely interested in things in a way that was both gratifying and exhausting. His classmates liked him. His mother assigned him extra work. Clara watched all of this from the stage of being 3, then 4, then 5, with the serene observational patience that was so entirely her own. And when she started school herself, she was so different from her brother that the contrast was a constant source of gentle comedy. Where Thomas arrived at conclusions by charging directly into them, Clara arrived by walking very carefully around them until she had seen them from every angle, and then stating them with a precision that made her sound, at 7 years old, alarmingly like both of her parents simultaneously. In the autumn of 1890, Winifred sat Phineas down in the kitchen with the specific air of someone who has something to say and has thought carefully about how to say it. "The Territorial School Board has asked me to join their advisory committee," she said. "It would involve 2 trips to Santa Fe per year and some additional correspondence. I want to do it." He looked at her. "Of course you should do it. Why are you telling me as though you are asking permission?" She smiled, a little wry. "I am not asking permission. I am having a conversation, because it will change the household rhythm, and you are part of the household and your opinions about the household rhythm are legitimately relevant." "My opinion," he said, "is that my wife should absolutely join the Territorial School Board Advisory Committee, because she is one of the most qualified people in the territory for the role, and I can manage 2 trips to Santa Fe's worth of single-parent household rhythm per year without difficulty." She looked at him with an expression that was both fond and very specifically happy. "I know you can," she said. "You are a very capable man. I also have Thomas and Clara, who between them can probably manage most of it," he said, which made her laugh, because it was both true and a comment on the uncommon self-sufficiency of their children. She joined the advisory committee, and the trips to Santa Fe became a biannual feature of their life, and the household rhythm adapted around them, and Phineas managed, as he had said he would, with the same quiet competence with which he managed everything. He made Thomas's school lunches with more arithmetic in them than Winifred would have chosen and made Clara's with more stories, having correctly identified their respective passions, and he answered their questions, of which there were many, with the honest directness of a man who considers children worth being honest with. The territory of New Mexico in 1890 was a different place from the territory of 1883, larger and more settled and more complicated in ways both better and worse. The Apache had been through a decade of brutal containment, a series of injustices that Phineas had watched with the specific anguish of someone who understands what is wrong and has limited authority over the scale of it. And he had used what authority he had where he could, in the specific cases in front of him, which was the only honest answer available to a man in his position. Winifred had used the school as a place of contact and humanity where she could, and the two Apache children who had enrolled in the school's second year had grown into young men who visited occasionally with the complicated feelings of people who live between worlds. There was no clean ending to those larger injustices, no satisfying resolution, and both Phineas and Winifred held that grief with the clear-eyed honesty that they brought to everything, without pretending it away and without allowing it to obscure what was also true: that the specific lives they touched, the specific children they taught, and the specific community they helped build were real and mattered, and that doing the good directly in front of you, carefully and with full attention, was not a small thing. In the spring of 1891, Winifred came to the kitchen again, which by now had become something of a ceremonial space for announcements of significance, and told Phineas that there was going to be a third child. He looked at her with the expression of someone who is simultaneously surprised and entirely unsurprised, and said, "Thomas and Clara are going to have strong opinions about this. Thomas will be delighted because he wants someone younger to experiment on," she said. "Clara will be thoughtful about it for approximately 6 months and then decide it is acceptable." Both of these predictions proved accurate. The third child arrived in December of 1891, a boy again, born in the now familiar bedroom with Dr. Aldrich and Mrs. Bell and the fire and the winter night outside, and named James, for no particular reason except that it was a good name and suited him. A round and serene baby who seemed to have arrived with the understanding that the household into which he had come was cheerful and busy, and that his proper role in it was to be cheerful in return. Thomas Carver, at 7, received the news of his brother with the extravagant enthusiasm of someone who has been waiting for a collaborator. Clara, at 4, looked at James for a long, considering time in those first days, and then announced that he was all right and could stay, which Winifred told Phineas was the most qualified endorsement she had ever received on behalf of one of their children. Phineas, who held James in the same way he had held Thomas 7 years before, with the same fullness and the same awe, looked across the bed at Winifred with her exhausted radiance and her dark eyes and thought, as he thought regularly, and without ever quite getting used to it, that the distance between the man he had been when he arrived in Redrock Flats and the man he was now was not measurable in miles or years, but in something else entirely. Something that had to do with having been genuinely known by someone and genuinely loved, and having allowed it, the enormous and continual choice to stop being careful in the wrong way and to be careful instead about what actually mattered. The years continued, and they were good years. Not uncomplicated, because no real years are uncomplicated, but good in the way that things built with care and honesty are good. Solidly, continuously, with the quality of something that does not need to be performed because it is simply true. Thomas grew up with his father's steadiness and his mother's articulate intelligence and became, at 12, the kind of boy who could argue a case with the precision of a lawyer and fix a fence with the competence of a rancher and was, both his parents agreed, going to be a considerable person. He had a particular gift for mathematics that made his mother, who respected the subject but did not love it, quietly delighted, because it was entirely his own, not inherited from either of them, a new thing in the family that had arrived from somewhere they could not trace. Clara grew up watchful and serene, and kind in the specific, undemonstrative way of people whose kindness is a considered thing rather than a reflexive one. And she had her father's gift for seeing the truth of a situation without announcing it, and her mother's gift for language. And at 10 she was already writing small, precise stories in a composition book that she did not show anyone but that Phineas had once, by accident and with considerable honesty when she caught him, read a page of, and which were better than they had any right to be from a 10-year-old, dark and warm and seeing. James grew up serene and strong, and with a quality of straightforward joy that was, both his parents agreed in private, entirely inexplicable given the parental genetic material, but entirely welcome. He loved horses and the desert and cooking, the last of which he took up at 6 in the kitchen that had been the ceremonial center of the Carver household for a decade, and which he eventually understood better than either of his parents, producing at 8 a corn bread that Winifred declared superior to Mrs. Bell's, a declaration she made quietly and out of Mrs. Bell's hearing, but which was sincere. Redrock Flats in the mid-1890s was a proper town. It had a newspaper, started in 1888, which had its own opinions about everything and which Winifred had argued with in print on 3 separate occasions, winning twice. It had 2 churches, a bank, a school with 4 teachers of which Winifred was the head, a library that had outgrown its original room and been expanded twice, a marshal's office with 3 deputies, and about 800 people who called it home. It had, in short, become the kind of place where roots could take hold and hold on, the kind of place that justified the people who had chosen it and the things they had built in it. And at the center of it, in ways both visible and invisible, were a woman and a man who had found each other in circumstances that had everything to do with injustice and refusal, and the choice to do the right thing when the wrong thing was considerably easier. There was an evening in the summer of 1895, a Thursday evening in July, warm and still and full of the particular summer insect song of the desert, when Phineas and Winifred sat on the porch of the Carver house, while the children were inside doing the various things the children did in the evenings. Thomas was 16, and almost certainly working on something mechanical or reading something his parents would find alarming. Clara was 12 and almost certainly writing in her composition book. James was 4 and almost certainly asleep. They sat on the porch in the 2 chairs that had been there for years now, the chairs that had shaped themselves around the habitual presence of 2 specific people, and they were quiet in the way that people are quiet when they have been talking for years and have discovered that comfortable silence is one of the better things on offer. After a while, Winifred said, "I was thinking today about the day you told me you hadn't filed the expulsion order." He looked at her. The porch light was warm on her face, and her hair, which had some silver in it now, worn the same way she had always worn it. "At the market," he said, "the blue calico. I had just been laughing at something Dollar said," she said, "and then I turned and you were there and I saw your face and I knew something had happened." She paused. "I think part of me knew what it was, what you had done." "You said I was in a very difficult position," he said. "You said you knew that," she said. "And you said it in the voice you use when something is settled, when you have already decided and are simply informing the relevant parties." He smiled. "You read me very accurately." "I have had 12 years of practice," she said. "I was not bad at it even before." "No," he said, "you weren't." She was quiet for a moment. "I have thought about that moment many times, what you must have been feeling, sitting in that office with that paper, what it took to simply not do it. It did not feel like courage," he said honestly. "It felt like the only possible thing. Filing it would have required a level of dishonesty about what I believed that I was simply not capable of." "That is courage," she said. "You just don't recognize it as such because you've never been the kind of man who required an audience for it." He looked at her. The evening light was falling into dusk, the sky going deep blue above the mountains, the first stars appearing. Inside the house there was the comfortable sound of the household being itself, Thomas at his work, Clara at hers. "I am very glad I didn't file it," he said, which was possibly the greatest understatement of his life. She laughed, soft and warm. "So am I," she said, "considerably." She reached across the space between the 2 chairs and put her hand in his, which he held the way he had been holding her hand for 12 years, with the same particular quality of attention and certainty. And they watched the stars come out over the desert and the mountains in the warm July dark, and the town that they had built their lives in went quietly about its evening business around them. Thomas, at 16, had begun asking questions about the law, which his father answered with the thoroughness of someone who had been thinking about the subject for 20 years. Clara, at 12, had shown her composition book to her mother, who had read it with the expression of someone genuinely surprised, and then asked very specific questions about particular passages, which Clara had answered with the careful precision of someone discussing their work with a peer rather than a parent. James, at 4, had recently learned the word why, and was deploying it with a frequency and creativity that kept all of them on their toes. The library had 63 children registered as members, which Winifred considered one of the true achievements of her professional life. The school had, in its 12 years of her headship, educated hundreds of children from families of every background the territory had produced, had watched them grow up and leave, and some of them return, and had been, in the way that good schools are, a place where the future was made more possible. The Marshal's office had, in Phineas's tenure, achieved a reputation for honesty and competence that was recognized across the territory. He had trained 6 deputies over the years, and 5 of them were still in law enforcement in various parts of New Mexico, which was not an accident. He had never lost another deputy. He had never fired his weapon except in one specific situation, a cattle thief who had drawn on him first, and who had survived and served his sentence. He had built his work on the principle that the law, when it served its proper purpose, was a form of care for the community, and that when it stopped serving that purpose, as it had in the case of Judge Pruitt and the expulsion order, the obligation of an honest man was to refuse, clearly and without compromise. He had no regrets about any of it. He had one long and continuing gratitude, which was that on the day the expulsion order had come to his desk, he had been the man he was, quiet and thorough and unwilling to be the instrument of injustice, and that this had been enough to begin something that had given him everything. The porch was their place in the evenings, through the summers and the winters that came after that July, through the years that continued to bring what years bring. Good things and hard things and ordinary things that proved, in retrospect, to have been the best things of all. Winifred's position on the Territorial School Board Advisory Committee grew into something that took her to Santa Fe 3 times a year instead of 2, and the Correspondence Society grew into a formal organization with a published newsletter. Phineas watched all of it with the quiet pride of a man who is entirely certain that the person beside him is remarkable and is entirely comfortable with the fact that the world is beginning to agree. Thomas Carver read law at the Territorial College in Albuquerque beginning in the fall of 1897, which was a source of pride to both his parents in different registers. Winifred because it was excellent and right, Phineas because it meant his son would have the tools that his own instincts had sometimes had to substitute for. Thomas was not quiet like his father or direct like his mother. He was something new, combining the best of them in a way that was entirely his own, and watching him leave on the Albuquerque train in the September morning light was one of those moments that is simultaneously a loss and a proof of everything having worked as it should. Clara kept writing. She published her first piece, a careful and observant essay about the desert landscape and what it meant to grow up inside it, in the Santa Fe New Mexican in 1899, when she was 16, under her own name, and the editor wrote back to say he would be pleased to publish further work if she chose to submit it. Winifred read the letter aloud at the kitchen table and then had to stop briefly, because something in her throat was doing something inconvenient. Phineas, who was sitting across the table and could see her face, said nothing, which was exactly right. James grew toward 10, then 11, still serene, still devoted to horses and cooking and the open desert, with a directness and warmth that made people trust him immediately and a quality of stillness that was his father's but louder somehow, his father's quietness made vibrant and social. He was going to be, both his parents agreed, a man who made rooms brighter by being in them. The century turned, in January of 1900, with all the ceremony and contemplation that a century's turning demands. Redrock Flats celebrated with fireworks, which had become available through the railroad, and a dance in the town hall, which the whole town attended. Phineas danced with Winifred, which he did every year at the town dance, and which he was, after 17 years of marriage, still not particularly skilled at, but approached with the good-humored commitment of a man who understands that dancing with his wife is a thing worth doing imperfectly. She laughed at him, lovingly, as she always did. He spun her anyway. On the porch that night, after the dance in the cold January dark, they watched the fireworks from across town, the colors breaking open above the desert sky, and Winifred leaned against him and said, "A new century." "A good one so far," he said. "It is 1 hour old," she said, amusement in her voice. "It came in very well," he said. "I'm optimistic." She laughed, the warm, private laugh that was his. He put his arm around her, and she fit against his side with the certainty of something that has always been exactly where it belongs. And the fireworks went on above Redrock Flats, above the desert and the mountains and the town they had built their lives in, above the school and the library and the marshal's office and the house with its good deep well, and the last of the century that had made them who they were faded into the dark, and the new one began, full of everything that was still to come. The life they had built did not announce itself. It did not need to. It was visible in the school with its full classrooms and its library of books. It was visible in the town that was more honest and more just and more itself because of the people in it who had chosen to care about it. It was visible in 3 children who were, in their different ways, becoming remarkable, and in 2 people who had found each other at a moment when finding each other was both improbable and absolutely necessary. Phineas Carver had arrived in Redrock Flats with a badge and a silence, and the firm intention of remaining uninvested. He had stayed to become the quiet center of a place that needed quietness and centeredness, and he had remained quiet in the particular way that quiet people who love deeply remain quiet, not as a barrier but as a kind of steadiness, a foundation that other things could grow on. Winifred Walker had arrived on the morning train with a trunk and a satchel and a letter from Father Medina, and an undefeated belief that every child's learning mattered and every person's dignity was worth defending. She had stayed to become the town's teacher and librarian and voice and conscience, and she had loved a quiet man with everything she had because he had been the first person since her father who had chosen right over safe without hesitation when it came to her. Neither of them would have said they had saved each other, because neither of them was the kind of person who thought in those terms. But they had each, at a crucial moment, been exactly what the other needed. She has reason to stop being deliberately solitary. He her protection at the moment the machinery of injustice had turned toward her with its full weight. And from that single act of refusal, from the moment he had turned the expulsion order face down on his desk and not reached for his pen, everything else had followed. The work together, the evenings in the lamplight, the walk on the old Spanish road with the Oscura mountains in the amber light, the kitchen where all the important things were said, the porch where all the important things were felt, the children who were the best proof of what they had built. On a morning in the spring of 1900, in the kitchen of the house with the good deep well, Phineas made coffee and Winifred corrected a set of composition exercises at the kitchen table, and James, at 8, ate his breakfast and described at some length a dream he had had about a horse that could fly, which he was narrating with great sincerity and considerable narrative skill. And outside the window the desert was going through its brief spring extravagance of color. And somewhere across town the school bell rang, and somewhere further away a train was coming in on the railroad, bringing whatever it was bringing, the ordinary continuation of everything. Winifred looked up from her compositions and caught Phineas's eye across the kitchen, and they exchanged the look of people who have been together long enough to have their own private language, the language of long love that requires no words at all. James reached the most dramatic part of his dream and arrived at the conclusion with a flourish, and looked at both his parents expectantly. And Phineas said, with perfect seriousness, "That sounds like a very capable horse." And Winifred pressed her lips together to contain the laughter, and the morning went on around them, warm and bright and complete.